Hi, everyone, and welcome to The Natural You. Today, we're going to be doing something a little bit different. I'm not going to have a guest on. Recently, I was invited by Hayley and Kelly to join their community, which is a supportive health community for parents, family members, chiropractors, health practitioners, and anyone searching for a different approach to health. One of the benefits to joining their community is a monthly Zoom call where you can learn about different approaches and ideas to health and healthy living for you and your family, and also have an opportunity to ask questions, get some answers, and to share with the group. This episode, I was invited to share with the community, and I was talking about rites of passage, something that I believe has been lost and something really needed in today's society. So have a listen into this edited version of my call with the Hayley and Kelly community.
We have this evening the magical Tim Wood. And I was just downstairs saying to Liam about the call, and he was like, "Oh, it's Tim." So there's a lot of love for you out there, Tim. And I'm sure you don't really need much introduction to the group. But my first memory of you was when you came to visit our practice actually in Reading. And I thought, oh, here's this chap with just a lovely energy. And then since doing the chiropractic from the heart, I know that you've facilitated with Stu many times. So it just is a beautiful human that you are. And it was really nice to read your bio, and I was learning about, you see yourself as the bridge between the head and the heart. And I just think that was perfectly put. So I was trying to think of how to introduce you, and I read that and I just thought that to me is what you are, just this huge heart walking around to be a shining light for us all. So thank you so much for joining us, and we're delighted to have you here, and I will pass over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, feels really good. Thank you. And I hope I can give you something a little bit different. As you might know, I'm sort of the nature guy. I run the Natural You podcast, and I run nature events and things like that. And chatting to some friends, I realized that we've done things in our family quite differently to a lot of other sort of parents and parenting styles. And today I want to talk about rites of passage and ceremonies for rites of passage. So in our modern day world, we have literally weddings and funerals as our kind of ceremonies we have. Occasionally, if you're in a religious tradition, you might have a christening or some kind of naming ceremony, but that's about it. For many people, it's like, when you turn 18, your dad might take you down to the pub and buy you your first drink, and that's your welcome to adulthood. We've done things quite differently, my wife and I. When my son's almost 22 now, when he was born, we had a naming ceremony for him, and we did that outdoors. We invited our friends around, and we had a naming ceremony for him, which I sort of led. And then the same for my daughter Lucy. She's 18 now, and I got introduced to a model by an author called Bill Plotkin. He wrote a very thick book called Nature of the Human Soul. And he is a psychologist, and he talks about a model called eco-psychology. So ecological psychology instead of ego psychology, which is a lot of the psychology we deal with nowadays. His book is amazing, but it's quite a tome. You've got to wade through the first bit. He explains all his terms, and it's pretty dry, but in there is some amazing stuff. And I'd like to just sort of touch on what he calls the wheel of life and the different stages of life that we go through. And I've used that to develop ceremony and rites of passage for my kids. So essentially, the wheel starts in the East, where we have birth, and then we go through early childhood, late childhood, early adolescence, late adolescence, and then only into adulthood, and culminating in late adulthood, and then into eldership, and then death, which then finishes in the East as well. When my kids were going off to school, I remember going to one of the meet and greets to high school, and your kids are 11 or so, and the teacher said, well, we teach these kids as young adults, and so they need to buck up and come along, and and I was like, well, hang on, these kids aren't even adolescents yet, and you want to treat them as adults. And they're actually, most of them are still in early childhood, let alone late childhood. It really struck me how discordant we are. And in nature-based cultures, they have these rites of passage. So when you have your naming ceremony, which might not be at birth, it might be when the tribe decides that you have a name, or your parents have gifted you that name. And obviously biological, we have rites of passage, and girls going to menarche first time. There's a biological change, and when boys start going to adolescence, there's a biological change, and that's a really easy one for us to kind of pick because there's this obvious change. Each stage has its own unique characteristics and unique gifts that we need to experience and explore. So when we reach the end of one phase and we're transitioning into the next, we need to acknowledge the gifts of the past stage and then move into the next phase and welcome that. And so we thank the past stage and then we move on. So I think I'll just share some stories of the ones that I designed for my kids. My son was just over 13 years old, and I designed a ceremony. I invited his two uncles. One lived in London, another one in Wales, and we drove to a location in Wales in the mountains, and we were going to be there for 2 days, 2 nights. And we set up camp. We just had a normal evening for the first night and had a barbecue on the fire. It was all wild camping, so it was just sort of out in nature. As you can imagine, I love to do that kind of stuff. And the next morning, my son didn't know, and I'd arranged it with his uncles. I'd arranged a big loop that we were going to walk. It was about 20 kilometers. He's 13. He's not, doesn't have done a lot of walking, but it's a big stretch for anyone. It's walking 20 k's in the mountain. And so I'd given my brother-in-law's places to meet us along the trail, unbeknownst to my son. And we headed off, and it started raining. We had to walk straight up this really steep cliff. And I said, Matt, this is a journey you're going to go on, and we're going to walk together. And we walked up, and it was really steep and really wet and foggy. We couldn't really see where we were going. We got to the top of the crest, and then we walked on for perhaps 5 kilometers or so. And then I stopped, and I turned to him, and I said, Matt, I'm going to have to leave you now. And you're going to have to walk this path on your own. And up ahead will be one of your uncles, and they will guide you on the next part of your journey. And then I had to see him disappear into the mist. And I sat down and I just bawled, right? It's like you're letting your son go into the wild on his own. And so the ceremony is as much for the parents or the family as it is for the person going through it. So Matt then walked on, and he met up with his next uncle, and he then walked with him for another 5 k's. I forget exactly what it was. And during that time, he was to give him some advice for this next stage of his journey. And so they walked together, and then he had to stop and let him walk again for another stretch on his own until he reached his final uncle. And then they did the same process and then looped back round to our camp where we'd met up with him. That's going to be the story of his life. He's going to be walking on his own and meeting different people and learning and going on. But you have to do a lot of that on your own. And that was his stepping from childhood into early adolescence. As we know, that's a tough time, but it gave him feeling like he was really stepping into something. And then that night, we lit a fire, and I took out one of his fluffy toys from his childhood, and I gave a little speech. That's tough. And the fluffy toy represented his childhood, and we were going to honor that and then give it to the fire because that stage was now over. And we gave it to the fire, and he was quite teary, and I was quite teary, but we honored that. And then we thanked that stage and everything that it brought and all the beauty, and we reminisced on stories, and we could then enter into the next phase. And so we had that night, and the next day we all kind of parted and headed off back home. But before we did that, one of his uncles, I'd asked him to do it. We'd taken 3 strands of leather, and we braided that, with 4 strands, braided that together and made a bracelet for him, because that represented the 4 of us and the things that he learned on his journey. And he wore that for best part of a year until it fell off, and then he pinned it to his board and had that, and he still has that as a reminder of that. And so now that he's almost 22, he's taken a long time in that phase, and he refused to get a job, and he didn't want to do his driver's license. And I said to him, what's going on? Why are you resistant? And I said, And we chatted about it a long time. And he said, because when I do, then that's the end of my childhood. And so he knew. And now finally he's taken those steps on his own accord. And so now I know he's ready. So I'm busy planning his next ceremony. And so in about a month's time, end of March, we're going to go out and do something different. I'm busy planning that at the moment. So that was Matt's journey. And then Lucy, also similar sort of age. We did something closer to home, and this time I wanted to include my wife and their mom and Matthew and things. So as a family, I planned it very, very carefully where we were going to go and what time of day we would go and what we did in the ceremony. So I went to a woodland not too far from us, and I found a grove of beech trees, which was really open. And there were 3 massive beech trees and a clearing underneath. And nearby, there were 3 stumps that had been sawn off, but you could see that they were still part of the grove. They were still being kept alive. And so when we walked in, and I had placed cross sticks in the middle of the clearing representing the 4 cardinal points. And we went, and interestingly, the east points where birth and death happened were where these stumps were, and they represented the elders that had passed, my parents. And so they were then part of that, and we brought the big trees and the elders all into this community. Various facets to the ceremony, and the first one was just honoring the space and the environment. And then we built a little fire, and I asked them, well, what does fire represent? And heat and warmth and food. And that was my son and her. And I said, okay. But fire was one of the most amazing things ever to happen to humanity. But it's incredibly dangerous. And so while it brings us this light, and interestingly, early adolescence is one of the kind of image for that is fire. It's the period of fire. You're going into the fire. All these changes, all these things are happening. And so we acknowledge the fire and the fire stage that she was entering into. And all of these are kind of outlined in Bill Plotkin's kind of ecocentric model. And so I use that as a template. And again, we took 2 toys. One was a little fluffy toy. Another one was a little thing she had made out of those hammer bead things. And then we thanked those as representing a child. And we also put that in the fire. Then I gifted her my childhood knife, which was a little dagger in a leather sheath. And because she can be sharp. She's got a real attitude, and she doesn't mind laying in and saying a few cutting things, and she's quick with it. And it can be very light and funny, but it can also be really dangerous. And so I said, this is your knife, and this is one of the most skillful tools. If you're in the wild, that's the one thing you want is a knife, because it offers protection and safety, and you can do almost anything with it. But at the same time, it can take a life. And so we have to be careful how we use our knives and our voice and how we go forward. So I gifted her that. Then her mum is a Christian, and so she did a prayer out of the Bible, and she read that prayer, which is basically a blessing, which is one of the oldest ones that we could find. And so we had that aspect coming in. So that was some of the Christian heritage coming through, and brought my wife into that, and not just Tim's dominating kind of eco nature boy stuff. She did that. We all put our hands on Lucy and we blessed her into this next phase. And then now it's getting dark, getting really dark. And the fire's gone out, and we're standing there, and I turn on our headlamps, and then I'd arranged with my son I told him to go up the path, because it was a big woodland, it's dark. I told him to go up 100 meters up, and I told him where to stand. I told him beforehand. And then I said to Lucy, you have to wait here, and I put a timer. I said, you've got to wait here for 10 minutes until that timer goes off. You're not allowed to move. You have to sit here in the dark on your own. And then I said, Janice and I were going to walk back the way we had came, because we are not allowed to go with her on this stage. And so we walked back, and what I hadn't anticipated was my kickback from my wife. She was freaked out. You can't leave her there. And I literally had to really say, come on, we got to go. And I said, we're going to walk back. You have to trust her, and you have to trust Matthew, because we're not going to be always there to lead her. She's going to have to lead on her brother. And so we walked away, and I made a compromise, and we were out of sight and hid behind a tree. heard the alarm go off, and then she walked off, and then Matt met her, and then they walked a long route round, and he had a headlamp to shine the way. They walked back together, and then they met us up just before we walked back to the car. And so those were two ceremonies to validate their childhood and allow them to leave that behind. And the reason I think this is so important is because what happens in our modern day culture is that we want our kids to stay in childhood forever. And then when the kids get into adolescence, they never leave. And we basically live in what we call a patho-adolescent society. So in adolescence, we want sex, we want to be liked, and we want to be popular, and we want to have stuff. And if we look at all our modern day leaders and societies, that's, every guy wants to drive around in a Porsche and look flash and have a young girl on his arm, and the girls want to have all the Gucci and the stuff and have their clique and be on, be the big stars, right? And that's where we want to be noticed. We want to be noticed in adolescence. We want to be part of that group, and we want to be acknowledged. And in patho-adolescence, we never leave. And so even though we might age, we've got 70-year-old adolescents. You look at some of our leaders, they are literally adolescents. And I'm not just talking about politics, I'm talking about in chiropractic and in our lives. How many of our parents are still holding that? How many of our people in our families and our communities are still... I met a guy this weekend, 74 years old, the chiropractor, and he's an adolescent. He's a playboy. He's been married 3 times. He was telling me stories about his 30-year-old girlfriend and how he can't keep up, and I was like, dude, wake up. And he's literally stayed there, and he's had a good run, but he can't accept that he's actually getting older. So even after adolescence, that's early adolescence. There's late adolescence, which my son is only going into at 22. And then we're going to early adulthood, late adulthood, and then into eldership. And so each quadrant of the northeast, southwest is divided into another 4. So they're kind of the 8 stages that he plots out. And we can progress to some of those, but if we haven't completed all our tasks in the earliest phase, we won't be able to progress. And that's why we have very few true elders. And we don't have elders to crown our elders. We don't have them to bring them in. So our whole system is broken down. In the old days, when the women reached a certain age, they were the wisdom keepers of the tribe, they would be crowned. That's where the old crone comes from. The word crone comes from the crown of the old crone, and they were then the wisdom keepers of the tradition of the clan. And we don't have the old crone. We actually denigrate the old crone. It's ugly. We've got a patho-adolescent society where women now have to have no hair, underarm hair, leg hair, pubic hair, everything's just got to go. And the kids too, they want to shave everything. This fascination with childhood and adolescence and not allowing ourselves to grow old. And we see it in the cosmetic industry and wanting to look young all the time. We're stuck in wanting to be young and looking pretty and being masculine and having bulging muscles. And so we have this patho-adolescent situation. And until we allow our children to go into adolescence and then acknowledge the passing of that, only then can we step into the next phases. And then hopefully we can build and restore some of our eldership. And even though it's not the right way around, because only elders can bestow eldership, we're going to have to acknowledge some of our elders and allow them to be elders to us. And so the younger cycles help the older parts, and the older parts support the younger ones. We need each other. And so the elders need people to follow them and to listen to them. And if we're going to pass through our stages, we need to acknowledge these stages. And some traditions have that in religious context, but it's usually around kind of teenage years as well. And it's about kind of learning the cultural ways and acknowledge that you understand your religious or cultural tradition. And in many native tribes, they have those at various stages, and they will have to go through initiation ceremonies. And so I think the ceremony is important. because it marks the period, it acknowledges the previous period, and it marks the walk into the next one. And for women in childbirth is obviously a big thing, but you can be a mom in adolescence, you can be a mom in older age, but you might still be in that phase. And so if you haven't accepted your next stage, then we're challenged by that. And I think they're big challenges, particularly for women in that. And men are just kind of, oh, it's okay, he can be a kid all his life. It's kind of, the playboy acting in that way. And this, if we talk about toxic masculinity, aggression, look, what do young boys do? They want to posture, they want to fight, they want to bully, they got to sort themselves out. It's still going on. And that's toxic masculinity is exactly what I'm talking about. It's because men have not been allowed and not been encouraged to transition into the next phase. And we just hold that in our world at the moment. So I will, I wish I could share the diagram with you because it gives you a lot more information. So if you're thinking about doing ceremony, and I encourage people to do this in your families, it takes planning and it takes forethought. It needs to be in a framework. So if you have a cultural tradition or religious tradition or family values, it has to hold to those. And so that will guide you. Your traditions and your values will guide you. Ideally, from my perspective, it would need to honor the previous stage. And there's huge amounts of gratitude for that, and reminding ourselves of that and how cool it was and how fun it was to be the parent of the child or whatever it is. And then acknowledging that, and then the gratitude for that, and then some kind of demonstration of that. So it might be burying something, it might be burning something, it might be letting something go into the air or writing it down. There are lots of ways we can do that, and lots of ways you can set it free down a river. Yeah. And I believe that we're really disconnected from nature, and it's hard to follow an eco-psychological model if we're not in the eco. So if we disconnected and you take a teenage boy who's gaming all day and you take him into nature, he's not going to know what the heck to do. I took my kids from a very early age. We'd go wild camping, we'd go hiking, we'd go walking, and we would sleep overnight, and we would do lots of nature-based things. I'm not saying you have to do that. If you can, brilliant. But taking them out, having time to play in nature, being in nature, and even as older kids or adults, we know how important that is, from our health perspective, from our emotional perspective, and we need to teach our kids the value of that. And then so if the ceremonies are then connected to that, then that helps to bring that together. I think it's quite difficult, unless you're going to follow different sort of models, but I think if we're going to teach our kids that the environment is important and that nature outside of us and nature inside of us is part of what we are and who we are, then we have to design our lives and our rites of passage and ceremonies around those to include those. So that would be my kind of advice or recommendation. And then so there's the honoring, and then there's the releasing of that, and then it's about the next phase. And so giving a hint at what might happen in that phase. So you might share stories from your adolescence or your next phase, or ones from literature and famous stories, and the excitement of what those things can be, but also the challenges and the risks associated with those. So we now are preparing them for that next phase in their lives. And so we're acknowledging the phase and we're inviting them to go into it. Your kid is going to get interested in sex. And I'm saying, yes, get interested in sex. Right? Not like, oh, be a kid forever. Let's invite that and so as I said earlier, it's as much for the parents to invite that stage, because isn't it just lovely? Wouldn't we just love a 4-year-old forever, right? Or 11-year-old kid who's just starting to wow, how awesome. But how awesome it is to see our kid in the fire and growing and changing, and how awesome it is to see them taking on responsibility and wanting to learn more and go out on their own. And each stage has its own blessing. But if we only cling to the old blessings, we're not allowing them to progress. And so it's as much for the parents and the family and the broader family. And if you can include, we were unfortunate, our grandparents are all in different countries, and so having family and wider family and community members that are on the same path as you, bringing them in to support. I mean, for women to have like a group of women take a young girl and tell him about their bodies in a very cool way, and how amazing birth can be, and pregnancy, and stories, instead of the horror stories that they get about how terrible it is, and oh, they might cut you open and it's the worst thing you ever experienced. And how does that prepare them? If we can prepare them in a loving way. And I was kind of researching a while back on what we could do for girls, and the one ceremony was the women would lay the girl down, and they would literally all just stroke her body from head to toe, and saying, "This is good, this is beautiful, this is amazing," and just reinforcing that body confidence, and being touched all over by women in a safe way, in a nurturing way, and putting oil on her, and just how amazing is that for a child to grow up in that, rather than not being able to show her body, or whatever it is. So those are some of the things that we can do, and there are lots we can play around, and having done ceremony and planned ceremony for other people, if you want some advice or help with that, that's some of the work I do. So you can let me know, and if it's just like, hey, this is some ideas, or can you think of something else and tell me, what you're looking for, I can perhaps give you some ideas. Sometimes we need a celebrant to lead that. So if you're not comfortable like doing a naming ceremony, then we can design something and I can do it, or someone else can do it, or there are different ways to do that. So just like we have celebrants for weddings and naming ceremonies and funerals and things, we have these other stages that we can do. And sometimes it's having someone not part of the family able to do that. But there's so many ways that we can facilitate that. So that's pretty much kind of my little chat, and I'm happy to take some questions. I know we've got a bit more time. I wasn't quite sure how long it'd take.
Yeah, that was just it's blown my mind open. Honestly, it's magic. Like it's just magical. Like thank you. It's not often, is it, we hear as adults like ideas that we've never really ever heard of before, and it made me think a little bit of 300, the Spartans.
Yes.
Yeah, which I'm sure you didn't do with your children because that is really brutal. But I know you shared what you did. But I was thinking, oh my goodness. But when I remember watching that and like thinking, gosh, like how could they do that? But yeah, that was just amazing. Thank you. I would like to know, did you have a ceremony? Did someone do that for you?
No, I did not have
Oh,
that. But I was very fortunate to grow up like in nature. And so I grew up on a farm in South Africa, and I had the run of the thing, and I was often on my own or with groups. And so yeah, I did. I guess I've had, the reason I'm talking about it because I had to do it on my own. I had to take myself off my own ceremony. So my last kind of transitional phase, I took myself into the wild, and I fasted for 3 days, and I slept in the wild in the mountains on my own, and I did my own ceremony because there was no one to do it for me. And I'm hoping to create something like that for our elders as well, because there's no elders. It shouldn't be me doing it, but the elders need someone to give them permission to be elders, and to tell them the tasks they have ahead for themselves and for us. And then hopefully they can bestow it on the next, and we can restore this process. And then we can start valuing elders and bringing them back into power, and so that they can hold the wisdom and the knowledge and impart it, and allow us to celebrate as we pass through. And because what happens is you have an 80-year-old who's just submitted, and they're going to die, and they've never transitioned through all the phases and all the beautiful things that come with that, because they've been stuck in path adolescence in a society that just promotes that. And so it's not because they don't want to, or they might have had aspects of wanting to learn that, but they've just capitulated and been forced into this egocentric model, which is really just kind of fodder for the industrial complex, right? Financial industrial complex. And so this is the antidote to that, or part of the antidote.
I think we're possibly all inspired to want to have our own little ceremony right now. And I know that probably everybody here is in different stages of life, but where would you sort of suggest as a starting point, if we wanted to do our own ceremony for ourselves, or maybe if we wanted to do something for ourselves but get other people involved.
I would first think about what kind of framework you want to be in. You know, for some people, it's very clear. They come from a religious tradition, they're going to want to do it in that kind of framework. I think it's brilliant. Some might have some cultural references from the past or want to honor previous lineages. You know, perhaps your parents grew up in a certain area and that you feel very close to, so perhaps you're Welsh or something and you go like, wow, I really want to feel my heritage and I want to honor that. Might looking into some Celtic things and some Celtic stories and things that you can bring in and make sure that you go to a place that resonates with that and go and explore. For me, half the thing is like when I'm preparing this, I go to different places. Like for Lucy's thing, I went to different things and I was like walking, I was like, oh, there it is. I was like just drawn to this thing. I was like, here we are, this is it. And then I researched all about the trees area and what their meaning was. And so I could read about those and give that to her. And then, asked Janet to look for the prayer that she wanted to give. And that allowed her to get involved. And so I would say, think about those aspects, what kind of framework you want to work in. And then also what phases you want to acknowledge. I think Bill Plotkin's stuff is, if you want to go eco stuff, I think it really maps it out really well. It's not an easy read, but it's so worthwhile. Bill Plotkin, the Soulcraft is the one, and Nature and the Human Soul is the big one. So that's all around eco psychology and these different phases, and you can find that there. So does that answer that?
It does, and it's funny, as you were talking, I was actually thinking that without realising it, there has been moments in life when we have done slightly ceremonial stuff just without the context. When I finally left Manchester, I actually went to where I grew up and sort of said goodbye to that because I knew I never wanted to go back and live there. So it's just funny how you're talking about things that, didn't necessarily realise it was a ceremony of sorts at the time. It was just important to do.
And the great thing is that you can actually go back, because we a lot of us have incompleted tasks from our previous phases because we never had them, and so you can actually go back. And so let's say one of the earliest phases is called Innocent in the Garden, and it's literally that time where you a little kid and you are just innocent, running around and being fascinated by nature. And some of us never had that opportunity, and so to go and relive that and give yourself permission and an environment to go, oh my God, I remember once with my daughter, she saw the slug and she spent half an hour looking at the slug and just touching it. And it was like, she was absolutely rapt. And giving yourself that example just to go back and do that. And then, and then just acknowledging that and thanking it. I think that's so important, is thanking that stage, because until we've thanked it, we can't really move on, and thank it all its blessings, and then allow us to go back and do other things to meet that. So yeah, definitely. We often do it, like you say, just sort of went back and said goodbye. I remember doing that on our farm and things like that. And we do that. I think kind of hen nights and stag do's have an element of that. And when I organized a stag do for my friend, we did drink beer, but we had ceremony too. We had fire, and each guy took a stick and added to the fire, and then with that he gave some words to the groom to be, and some kind of advice. And once that burns down, we just look at the fire until it's gone, and then so there's silence. And then the next guy comes, put his log on, and then he tells a story about the guy and what he remembers and what he hopes for his future, and maybe a blessing or whatever it is. Yeah, we're still drinking beer and having a laugh, but there's some ceremony to it.
So it's just magic. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Yeah, inspired's not the right word. I just sort of feel really, I don't know, uplifted and positive for humanity, I think is probably it.
It's a start, I think, for our next generation. And if they're going to care for the natural world and care for proper human development in a non-pathadolescent society, we have to create it for them.
Yeah. Well, you're making great steps doing that for us all, Tim. So thank you.
2. We started with 2.
I have to start somewhere.
We'll speak to my kids in a couple of years. Maybe we'll go to Hell in a Handbasket.
Brilliant. Well, Tim, thank you so much for your time. It was just brilliant. Thank you for joining us, everyone.
Take care.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye now.
Thank you for listening, and I hope that inspired you to think about creating ceremony and rites of passage in your community. If you want some more information about doing that or how to create that, please feel free to reach out for me. I've also included Hayley and Kelly's community contacts in the show notes. So should you want to reach out to them or see the benefits of joining the community, it's all there for you in the show notes. I'm also going to include links to Bill Plotkin's book and the ecocentric and egocentric model, so you can get a clear idea of what I was referring to in the talk. So thank you again, and look forward to sharing with you soon.